3 years ago, a 25-year-old Honduran national named Medina Ulloa was stopped by Border Patrol agents in Texas. He gave them a fake name and lied about being a juvenile, but instead of kicking him out of the country, authorities gave him a notice to appear for a court date that everyone knew he, of course, would never actually attend. And then Ulloa was flown to Jacksonville, Florida, where he was taken in by a 46-year-old father of four. Soon afterwards, the immigrant beat the man to death inside his own home. Now, last year, Medina Ulloa pleaded guilty to murder and received a 60-year sentence. And during the course of the prosecution that led to that plea deal, we learned a lot of details about what actually happened. We learned that Ulloa had attempted to tamper with evidence, for example. We also learned from home security footage that Medina Ulloa pummeled his victim with a chair before repeatedly stabbing him. But there was one critical detail that was never explained, even though it's maybe the most important piece of the entire story. And that is, how did Medina Ulloa get to Jacksonville? Did he buy a ticket himself, even though he had no money? Did someone else buy a ticket for him? Did he drive all that way? How did he get the car to drive? Or did Medina Ulloa arrive in Jacksonville on one of the Biden administration's secret resettlement flights, which take off in the middle of the night and ferry thousands of illegal aliens from Texas to destinations all over the country, maybe including Jacksonville? Now, in this case, the victim's daughter claimed that Ulloa had indeed arrived on one of those resettlement flights, and she would have reason to know that. Again, her father had allowed this guy into his home, and presumably they talked about how he had arrived in Jacksonville in the first place. But for their part, the Biden-Harris administration has refused to say anything about the arrangement, one way or another. Even when a Republican congressman formally asked the Biden administration to explain exactly what happened, they didn't confirm or deny that they had flown Ulloa into Jacksonville. Now, of course, it almost certainly means that they did indeed put him on one of their many charter jets for illegal aliens. And therefore, when Ulloa committed murder, the DHS knew that they were complicit. Their policy had facilitated a brutal killing. And so they decided not to talk about it. That was their solution. The federal government under Joe Biden and Kamala Harris apparently decided that they'd rather cover up their role in a homicide instead of taking action to prevent future homicides from occurring. So it's not surprising that those homicides have continued to occur in similar fashion. As you may have heard, the trial of 26-year-old Venezuelan illegal alien Jose Ibarra got underway this week in Athens, Georgia. Ibarra is accused of murdering Laken Riley, a 22-year-old nursing student, near a jogging trail at the University of Georgia back in February. Prosecutors say that Ibarra put on a hoodie-style jacket and a black hat and black disposable gloves, and then went off to, quote, hunt for females on the university's campus. Now, what we didn't know until yesterday is how exactly Ibarra got to Georgia in the first place. The government certainly didn't bother to tell us, but during the trial yesterday, we learned the answer to that question. According to Ibarra's roommate, just like Medina Ulloa, he received a taxpayer-funded resettlement flight. In the case of Ibarra, the flight took him from New York to Georgia. In other words, the Biden-Harris administration didn't just enable the murder of Laken Riley with their lax border policies, they also facilitated the murder by actually transporting the murderer to the place where he committed the crime. Watch.
Someone else that you got to know, that you lived with while you were here in Athens?
¿Alguien más que llegaste a conocer que vivió con ustedes aquí en Athens?
Giancarlo Hernández.
Giancarlos Hernández.
And how did you get to Athens?
¿Y cómo llegaron a Athens?
En Nueva York pedimos en Manhattan.
In New York, we asked in Manhattan.
En el Hotel Roosevelt.
And Hotel Roosevelt.
De Manhattan pedimos un vuelo humanitario aquí hasta Atlanta.
In Manhattan, we requested for a humanitarian flight to come here to Atlanta.
And when was that?
¿Y cuándo fue eso?
Como el de 9 a 10 de septiembre.
Around the 9th, 10th of September.
And where did you go when you arrived in Athens?
Y cuando llegó a Athens, ¿a dónde fue?
Al aeropuerto airport.
To the airport.
Al aeropuerto de Atlanta.
Airport.
Jackson Airport.
So that's great. Our trials in this country can't even be in English anymore. So, if we had a Department of Homeland Security that actually cared about securing the homeland, as it would seem that they should care about, because that's in the title of their agency, we wouldn't be hearing about this now, months after the fact and weeks after the election, not incidentally. We'd have heard about it back in February. The government would have acknowledged that they paid the airfare for a murderer, and there would have been months of congressional hearings by now. We'd know every detail about how exactly this brutal killer was ferried throughout the country at taxpayer expense. Instead, the Biden-Harris administration refused to say a word about this. It fell to a local prosecutor in Georgia to reveal that the federal government was covering this criminal's airfare. This is especially egregious when you consider that the DHS knew that Ibarra was a member of one of the most dangerous gangs on the planet. New York Post and News Nation have confirmed that, according to DHS sources, Jose Ibarra was a member of Tren de Aragua. And if you're keeping track, that's the same gang that's taken over several apartment complexes in Colorado. And this is the person they were paying to transport across the United States. Which really makes you wonder how many of those Colorado gang members were transported for free from the southern border. I mean, how did they get into Colorado? It also makes you wonder when we can expect criminal trials for the DHS officials who allowed this to happen. They were transporting a criminal that they knew or should have known was a member of a violent transnational criminal organization. How's that any different from offering, say, a member of ISIS a free one-way ticket to Manhattan? At a certain point, you can't pretend to be surprised at the natural and foreseeable consequences of government policy. When you facilitate the transportation of dangerous criminals who are members of notoriously brutal gangs, you don't get to feign astonishment when they go on to commit brutal crimes. And it's not as if Ibarra wasn't sending up red flags left and right, even apart from his gang ties. After the Biden administration let him into the country in September of 2022, supposedly due to a lack of bed space, which doesn't seem especially relevant since we don't need bed space to deport him. But since then, Ibarra somehow arrived in New York City, and once there, local officials put him up in the swanky Roosevelt Hotel in Midtown Manhattan. While he was there, he had access to free healthcare, free housing, free meals, even legal services to help him prepare his fraudulent asylum application. But that wasn't enough to keep Ibarra out of trouble. In August of 2023, Ibarra was arrested in New York for acting in a manner to injure a child less than 17. He was also hit with a vehicle license violation, according to DHS officials. But the local DA, Alvin Bragg, was too busy prosecuting the leading presidential candidate for an ancient business records violation, so he couldn't be bothered to prosecute Ibarra or give a heads up to federal immigration authorities. So Ibarra was released quickly and without any bond. Then Ibarra headed to another sanctuary city, thanks to the Biden administration's resettlement flight, Athens, Clarke County, Georgia. On October 27th, he was given a citation for shoplifting. Under the left-wing DA's policies, Ibarra wasn't arrested for the offense at the time. Instead, he was ordered to appear for a court hearing in December. But, of course, Ibarra ignored that hearing. So an arrest warrant was issued on December 20th. But he was never arrested. For months, he wasn't bothered by local authorities or by Biden's DHS, despite all of the crimes he committed in this country, across the country, and despite an active arrest warrant. He wasn't bothered in any way until February, when he put on his disposable gloves and murdered Laken Riley. And as the prosecutor outlined today, it was a vicious, brutal killing. Riley fought for 18 minutes, up until the point that her smartwatch recorded that her heart had stopped.
And when Laken Riley refused to be his rape victim, he bashed her skull in with a rock repeatedly. That is what this case is all about. The evidence will show that Laken fought. She fought for her life. She fought for her dignity. So the medical examiner, Laken was sent to GBI headquarters in Atlanta or Decatur, where Dr. DeMarco conducted an autopsy on her the very next day after her murder. What the medical examiner found is that Laken had a complex depressed skull fracture on the left side of her head, and she had 8 other lacerations on the left side of her head, which literally look like holes. She had a smaller subarachnoid hemorrhage on the right side of her head, and she had multiple abrasions to her face, her neck, and her torso. She also had what's called petechia in both eyes, which is consistent with some form of asphyxia.
Now, one of the many ways that investigators were able to tie Ibarra to this crime is that just hours before he killed Riley, he posted photos of himself on Snapchat. And in those photos, he was wearing a black Adidas hat, a blue jacket, and a black and white shirt. Then after the killing, a man wearing the same clothing was captured on a Ring-style camera discarding a blue jacket into a dumpster. And when that jacket was tested, it contained Laken Riley's DNA. Watch.
At 9:44 in the morning, about 15 minutes after Laken Riley's heart stopped, this is what they see. So they saw an individual who they did not know who it was at the time, dump the jacket in the dumpster and go to those bushes there and dump something there.
Now, as you recall, the country endured a year of rioting over George Floyd, costing billions of dollars and leading to the deaths of several Americans. Police stations and churches were torched, federal courthouses were attacked, small businesses were destroyed. Members of Congress wore kente cloth and got down on one knee. It was all in service of a lie that Floyd's death was the result of systemic injustice instead of his own decisions. In particular, his decision to spend his life committing serious crimes, culminating in an attempt to defraud a business while high on enough fentanyl to kill a horse. Now, the murder of Laken Riley, on the other hand, actually was the result of systemic injustice. The government provided her killer access to this country in violation of the law. Then the government gave him free housing and meals and airfare to go wherever he wanted, which is very common, by the way. As House investigators found earlier this year, more than 50 airports have been used by DHS to transport more than 400,000 illegal aliens in this manner since January of last year. More than 1 million illegal aliens are on the waiting list right now. And the government did all this without putting it up for a vote or asking whether Americans wanted this to happen, even though overwhelmingly, of course, they don't. And then after one of these illegal aliens brutally murders a nursing student, the President of the United States finally apologized, but not to the victim or her family. Instead, he apologized for calling the killer an illegal during the State of the Union after mispronouncing Laken Riley's name. Here's that again to refresh our memories.
Laken Riley, an innocent young woman who was killed by an illegal. That's right.
You used the word illegal when talking about the man who allegedly killed Laken Riley.
An undocumented person. And I shouldn't have used illegal. It's undocumented. When I spoke about the difference between Trump and me, one of the things I talked about on the border was that the way he talks about vermin, the way he talks about these people polluting the blood. I talked about what I'm not going to do, what I won't do. I'm not going to treat any of these people with disrespect. Look, they built the country.
Now, when Biden made that apology, he knew that Riley's death could have been prevented several times in several different cities. His DHS knew that they had assisted the perpetrator of this heinous crime several times over. But the only apology that Biden could muster was to criminals like Jose Ibarra. He said illegal aliens built this country, which doesn't even begin to make sense. He didn't say a word about the role of these secret resettlement flights in causing Laken Riley's death, maybe because he was hoping we'd never find out about it. But now we have found out about it thanks to testimony from the killer's roommate, who incidentally is also in the country illegally, of course. This is what the open borders agenda means in practice. And we're once again seeing how a policy that's supposedly premised on compassion for illegal immigrants in reality translates into brutality and death for American citizens. That's been obvious to most people on the right for a while now, but now it's getting hard for anyone to ignore. That's why the exit polls show Kamala Harris losing on the immigration issue across party lines. The vast majority of Americans recognize at this point that we shouldn't be flying these illegal aliens throughout the country in the middle of the night or at any other time of day. We should be flying them out of the country back to wherever they came from. That's what the incoming Trump administration is promising to do. And unlike the Biden administration, the new administration isn't going to hide these flights. And the new border czar is openly promoting them already. And why shouldn't he? Enforcing the law is overwhelmingly popular. It's what Americans want. And, you know, the great thing is when you're implementing a policy that's actually popular and it's what people want, it's what Americans want, you don't need to do it under the cover of darkness. You can talk about it on cable news, which is exactly what Trump's nominees are doing. This is a change that, as this trial in Georgia demonstrates, can't come soon enough. With the killing of Laken Riley months after the fact, we have discovered that the U.S. government was effectively an accomplice to the murder of an American citizen. And she's not the only one. They didn't just create the conditions that allowed this killing to happen by opening the border. They did do that, but they also facilitated the killing by providing repeated material support to the murderer. And then they tried to cover it up. And by the way, 6 Republican senators voted to confirm the DHS secretary who oversaw all of this. Something to keep in mind as the Trump cabinet appointments make their way through the Senate. Any senator who voted for Alejandro Mayorkas should explain that vote. And those senators, the ones who are still in office anyway, should explain what they plan to do going forward to dismantle the open borders agenda instead of enabling it, as they have been doing. And the murder of Laken Riley makes it very clear that this change is long overdue. Once the killer is brought to justice in Georgia, all of his many enablers in the government should also be held to account. It's the only way to prevent a murder like this from happening again. And it's the only way to ensure that Americans can have any trust in their government going forward. This is the kind of radical reform that Americans actually voted for. Before the next woman like Laken Riley is killed, we need to enact it. If you'd like to see what else I have to say, you can access my full show by going to dailywire.com or by going to the Matt Walsh Show Twitter page. Hope to see you there. Godspeed.